This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Beyond the Big Screen. And this is one that I know I've been looking forward to talking about for a long time. But before we get started, I am joined by our frequent guest, really co-host, Frank. Frank, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Super pumped to talk about Tombstone, probably the second most quotable movie ever after Top Gun.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So we are talking about the 1993 film Tombstone. It's starring basically everybody from the early 90s, 80s, up into the 2000s, I would say. I mean, I'm hard to press to find anybody who was likely missing from here.
Yeah, it's a star-studded cast, and they all turn in a great performance too. I mean, there wasn't a weak performance in the lot. We'll talk about it later on. There was one that I thought didn't quite ring quite true for me, but I think that's me, not the actor.
So how we're going to do it is we're going to go over a basic overview of the history. Then we'll talk about the movie. Then Frank and I will get into a little bit of the things that we love. I think it's going to be a little more weighted towards loved on this episode than hated. And then we will assess the movie overall. So the real basic, we're talking about the Earp brothers, the Old West, Wyatt Earp. The Earp brothers, there's the three main brothers that are featured in the film. We have Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan, Virgil being the oldest. The movie really focuses on their time in Tombstone, Arizona in the 1870s and the 1880s. But each of them had a storied career before they ever went to Tombstone. The story of Wyatt Earp is the story of the Wild West. He's bopped around a lot, which was very common. If you look up any one of the people featured in this film, every one of them lived multiple places. The Earp brothers were through doing some reading, I found that they were maybe grifters. They were certainly pimps at certain times. They were criminal elements, but they were also, through state, local, and federal law enforcement, they were entrepreneurs. They hung out with some of the very best of the Wild West and some of the very worst of the Wild West. Wyatt Earp really made his big name in Dodge City, Kansas, which was the absolute hell on wheels of the Wild West. And that's where he made his name as a law enforcement officer, but he would eventually... The whole Earp family moved to Tombstone their hope was to put their law enforcement background to the side and move on to being rich entrepreneurs. That didn't exactly happen. What's your assessment of the Earps? I'm kind of interested as a law enforcement officer yourself. What do you think about them?
Well, it was definitely a different time. As you point out, they jumped back and forth between being gamblers, entrepreneurs, people who were speculators when it came to mines and mining claims and so forth. From the histories that I've read, it's almost certain that some of them were in fact pimps, and yet they all served in various capacities as law enforcement. So the line between the two is clearly fuzzy and gray, very much unlike today, where, to become a law enforcement officer, you have to go through a ton of screening and it's pretty rigorous. You wouldn't be able to be a pimp and a police officer at the same time, or even successively, one after the other. Well, I guess you could go from cop to pimp, but definitely not the other way around. But I think this was the society at the time, really, wasn't it? I mean, the mores of the East Coast were not necessarily firmly in place anymore. That was a completely different world that was more reliant on what you could do as an individual, and your role was not as restrictive in terms of how you were defined.
I found of the three of them, it seemed like Virgil was the most law and order, and probably the best law enforcement officer of the best of them. Wyatt kind of floated in the middle, and then Morgan, I don't think he had a law job outside of some connection to Wyatt or Virgil.
Yeah, I mean, if you had this conversation in 1924, well, I guess a little bit before that, before Wyatt started, talking to the movie stars and such, I think history would, in that period of time, would have seen Virgil Earp as the most notable of the brothers. I mean, he was the oldest. He was a law enforcement officer in Prescott, and then when he came to California after Tombstone, despite the loss of the use of his left arm, he was a town marshal again. So yeah, I think you could say he was the closest thing to a career law enforcement officer, whereas Wyatt shuttled back and forth between these different roles, and Morgan seemed even a little bit shadier, I mean,
yeah.
And of course the other brothers don't even show up. I mean, James Earp, I can't remember if he was older than Virgil or if he was second, but he was one of the older brothers, and he was a saloon keeper and a pimp, and the younger brother Warren, was kind of a tag along and got into trouble with him. And I mean, he went on the Vendetta Ride though, and that's not included in the film here. Just the three really is all we see.
I got from and we'll get into the movie, that through my researching and reading it, I guess put all our chips on the table. I've for a as long as I can remember, been a Wild West aficionado. And I just always loved going to the West, go to Colorado. I mean, I live here in Texas. I always try and search out Wild West history. So this is one of my most favorite topics. Where do you sort of stand on the Wild West?
It's probably second tier for me. I'm more of an ancient history buff, more of a Rome and the ancient Mediterranean world, and then some American history, which includes the Wild West. I would say this is probably the second tier for me, but I'm really interested in it because it is a very nuanced time. You did not have all the strictures of society directing how someone should act, who they should associate with, what they should do for a living, how they should make their money, how they would distribute justice, as we're going to get into. So definitely it's something I've always been interested in, and Wyatt Earp in particular, because he's such a mystical figure. And when I got into law enforcement, there were a few sayings that Wyatt Earp had that were still applicable to a 21st century law peace officer.
I think there's something to say for that setting as well. It's the time right after the Civil War. Reconstruction is going on. I think that it was a time that I get the sense that there was as much feeling of change as there is maybe today, where technology changed so much. Just during Wyatt's time as a peace officer in Dodge City really existed because the cattle were raised in Texas, sent up through Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska into Dodge City. And then Dodge City was where the Transcontinental Railroad met up. And then the cattle could get sent either east or west out of there. And just the Transcontinental Railroad by itself, where a trip from New York to San Francisco could have taken you 6, 7 months if you were lucky, and depending on conditions. After that railroad got started, it turned into a couple of week journey. And that change, and then the telegraph, plus everything else that came with it. There's a great show that was from maybe about 10 or 15 years ago now, Hell on Wheels, that dramatized the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And everything was just so mixed up. You had corporations mixed up with the government. I guess maybe that's another parallel for today, but that's a different story for a different day. But that's another really interesting parallel to today, is that all these different changes are going on and people are just trying to figure it out. And Wyatt, I think, exemplified a lot of it. As soon as Dodge City settled down and got kind of burned out, he moved on to the next place and to the next place and to the next place.
You're also talking about a generation, and you pointed it out. This is, in the aftermath of the Civil War. We're talking about, a decade or so later, or even 2 decades later. You're still talking about a generation that was affected by that conflict, was hardened by that conflict, and all of the social implications that it had. And there's a lot. I mean, there are still hard feelings about that today. And, how many years ago was it now? I mean, it was more than a century and a half ago, and yet there's still hard feelings. So imagine a decade and a half, 2 decades after, when people who were in their, teens and 20s during the war are now in their 40s, that still has an impact on them. And I think any society that is shaped by a war, I think it has a pretty tremendous impact on how they look at life and how they look at every challenge that they're faced with. I mean, look at World War I, look at World War II. I mean, those generations were heavily influenced by those events and the hardships that they faced. And so you couple that with, going west, even with trains, certainly before, it was no picnic, as you point out. So, as a hard people, I think if you and I went back as sightseers, we'd be, with our time machine, I think we'd be picked out pretty quickly for how soft we probably are in comparison.
That's a great point, and it segues to actual Tombstone, Arizona, and that's where a lot of those currents bash up together. The Republicans, who are more predominantly a Northern party, they butt up into Democrat politics, which was more of a Southern party at that point. And then you had the Texans, they had been migrating through New Mexico throughout the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s into Arizona. But then you have the Northerners as well. Then the Northerners are bringing more of the federal power to the area, and then more of the corporate interests into Arizona. And Tombstone seems to be where all of that mashes together.
Yeah, and let's not forget that this is happening, contemporaneous to or just slightly after the Lincoln County Wars in New Mexico, the ones that, Billy the Kid is probably the most popular person that people would know that was involved in that. But that was a political war as well. I mean, it was a war of merchants too. Every political war is really about money when you get down to it. And that's what the Lincoln County War ultimately was about: money and control. People were using law enforcement appointments as, they're weaponizing them, to try to come out on top in that particular conflict. And so to see the same kind of thing happening, just, one state away in the Arizona and in Tombstone, and these two factions, they even had their own newspapers, they each had their own newspapers. And so, you want to talk about getting two sides of the story. The same event was described very differently in each of those. So, it was an interesting time. It was a very different time. But as you point out, Steve, I think you can make some parallels to some of the polarity that we're dealing with today. On a much more local level there. But they didn't have Twitter or Instagram either.
You make a really good point about the Lincoln County War. I think for me, it always made it those range wars, and there were several of them that were really bloody affairs that went on. And it really brings the stark difference. That's a stark difference between today and then with police and law enforcement and really government. Today, we at least have maybe expectation isn't the right word, but we have the hope at least that government and the police are a neutral arbiter between factions. And then if you had that tin badge, it really didn't mean that you were going to stand above and have a really fair and balanced view. And no matter what, you were going to enforce the law. That tin badge on somebody's chest was really who was going to be the enforcer for one side or the other. And that could very easily change. That's something that we see in Tombstone, is that all the levels of law enforcement that we're going to talk about the county sheriffs and then the town police department. They were really essentially enforcers for their faction.
Yeah, well, there wasn't any nobility necessarily in most of those offices in terms of public service being the forefront of why they existed. I mean, the offices didn't exist to provide the public with service. They existed for the men who held those offices to forward their own agendas, which clearly is not beneficial to the public, and we've reversed that in the modern day for the most part. I do think probably the town marshal comes closest to the way it is in a modern sense. I think that the people of the town, hired somebody specifically to police that town, and I think that public safety and order was probably at the forefront of what they were looking for in that individual. So, if you see a town marshal listed, my guess is probably that person probably was there to provide service to the public. It was very localized, though. But when you get to the county sheriff, well, that was and currently still is an elected position. And not having worked at a sheriff's department, but having worked alongside one, politics are an interesting thing to mix with law enforcement. And that's not to say that the chief of police isn't also a politician, but it's a different sort of thing when you don't have to worry about being elected in 4 years. You just have to do your job today, and the mayor can fire you tomorrow. It's a different sort of mentality, I guess. And of course, if you got a federal commission and you're in the Arizona territory, or was it a state at this point? I don't remember if it was actually a state or still a territory.
It became a state until maybe 1912, so it's a ways away from statehood.
Okay, so you have a federal commission in Arizona territory, and that's a little ways away from whoever's overseeing that, and so yeah, it's a messed up time for. I mean, if you're looking for Dragnet and Adam 12 and the good guy cop, the Untouchables, that's not what you have here. Except, like I said, maybe in the town marshal position, perhaps, but like you very accurately point out, the men don't exist to use the position for public service. The position in their mind exists to help them forward their own agenda.
And I think that, that breakdown of town marshal, county sheriff that you bring up, the town marshal was probably, if we get into what frontier justice looked like back then, the town marshal probably as a first responder was somebody you could be fairly reliant on if you lived in town. But if you lived more than a horse distance from town, you're probably more or less on your own.
Well, yeah, you can't get on the telegraph and call 911, I mean,
yeah,
you're totally on your own. At least if you live in town, you can, bang a bell or a cowbell or something, or yell and scream, and somebody might come. But you're right. I think you're totally on your own.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. That even in a lot of places today, we have a parcel of ranch land in Texas, and if you look at it in the big scale, you can get 5G internet out there, and driving distance, you're not too far from two of the biggest cities practically in the whole country. But in this particular place, like when we stay out there on a Saturday night, within probably an hour's drive, there might only be one or two cops, maybe a DPS officer who just happens to be driving through the county, or, the county sheriff. There might be one on duty. So you have to be prepared, at least for self-defense wise. You might consider that, but also just emergency medical. You better have a pretty decent first aid kit, because it could be a half an hour before the fire department or the EMS can get to you. And then now we're talking back in the 1870s, you're 100% on your own. And we're not just talking about if some bunch of ruffian kids come onto your parcel of land. You're talking about Comanches or Apaches who might roll through your ranch.
Yeah. We lived out before we moved down here to Central Oregon. We lived about 40 minutes outside of the city. And I mean, there were people. We were on about 11 acres, and there were people on the next lot over and so forth. So it's not like we were alone, but we were good. I'll bet we were 20 minutes from any kind of a police response at best. And medical as well. And you're right. You do adopt a much more self-reliant mindset. I mean, I had a generator wired in so that, I could plug it into the house and keep a few core parts of the house up and running in the event of a snowstorm that was down for, an extended period of time. Things like that. That's the way everybody lived in the Arizona territory. Even if they lived in town to a degree, but certainly if they lived out on their own homestead.
I wonder, what did you think about, did you have, when reading this story and watching the movie, like really do a mind change and a mindset change, especially given your law enforcement background? Or did you think that it was pretty easy to visualize and to get yourself into the mind of that this is a very different time and place that they're living in?
Yeah, I think it takes a little bit of a mind shift, because I was a municipal police officer. And so, we would backup was 30 seconds to a minute away, realistically. I mean, even on graveyard shift where you had fewer officers, but there was less traffic. People could drive faster. So it kind of evened out. I don't remember ever feeling like I was truly on my own. I had situations where I had to end up dealing with it on my own, because even, a minute to 2 minutes away was too long, and I had to handle it. But, when you work in a rural environment, like, sometimes state troopers do, certainly county deputies might, and in smaller towns as well. I think you have to approach things just slightly differently. I think you have to be better at talking to people. I think you have to be better at reading people and figuring out, is this going to be a problem right away? I think you have to be more decisive. Well, not more decisive. I think you have to be willing to be brutally decisive, if you think things are going to go wrong, because you might be on your own completely. It's just you. And so when you think about it from the standpoint of Wyatt Earp or one of the other, law enforcement officials in that time period, there's not a lot of room for relying on someone else to take care of business. So it was a shift, in thinking, because it just wasn't my experience. I'm not saying we were wimps or anything. It's just we police differently when you have manpower at a certain level or access to it. You just don't have that in this setting. And there are cops out there today that don't have it either. I don't think it's as bad. I don't think they're not quite as alone, but they're still on their own sometimes. And communication becomes important. And then, like I said, reading people and knowing, okay, I can reason with this person, or this person is absolutely insane on drugs right now. And, I need to consider my approach based on that. I don't know how many times he did it in real life, but they show it in the film, and you read about it, about Wyatt Earp buffaloing guys, just whacking them on the head with the 6-shooter. That was kind of a gift in a way, because option number 2 might have been to fire the 6-shooter. So that was, a way that he handled it. There's a scene in this movie that's another way that I think Earp handled it, and the way he's rumored to have handled it, and that shows a matter of steel and resolve. And I think that is probably something that you would be definitely required in this setting for anybody, even attempting law enforcement.
We get into the events in Tombstone here. Tombstone is a really interesting place because it melds in these two ideas of the gold rushes. In this case, it's silver, and it brings in people who it's not necessarily just some hard up on his luck guy who thinks he's going to go and pan for gold and get that one nugget and become a millionaire. It's more industrialized at this point, but maybe lower end. You didn't have to be a Rockefellers, quite aren't there yet, but you don't have to be the richest person, but you have to have a little bit of money. And that's, at this point, the Earps do have a little bit of money, and they're able to invest and become entrepreneurs, but they really quickly get involved in all of the town politics. And just to get through things really quickly, what eventually happens is Virgil becomes the town marshal. He brings on his brothers, and they get into conflict with this gang. And we'll get into how the movie portrays the gang. Are they quite a gang? Kind of a gang. They're definitely a loose confederation they call themselves the Cowboys. And the term cowboy is pejorative in a term that it's not just people who are ranchers who move cows around. These cowboys are definitely rough and tumble customers. They kill people. They live on the very knife's edge of legality. Some of them are pretty legal ranchers, but other ones are just straight up criminals who will sneak into Mexico, steal cattle from Mexico, go sell it to the government. The government is the army particularly. Sometimes they don't ask a lot of questions about where the cattle comes from. Sometimes they do. And there's a lot of really ugly politics going on here. The Earps find themselves in conflict with these cowboys. Eventually, that leads to a really decisive conflict between them at the shootout of the OK Corral that everybody is, I would imagine, familiar with. Virgil, in his attempt to try and bring some law and order to the town, bans I would imagine it's all carrying, open and concealed carrying of weapons in the town, which was pretty common in the Wild West then. You might call it common sense gun control, where if you're in town and you're getting loaded, you have to check. Loaded meaning drinking an excessive amount, which was common for cowboys. You would have to check your guns in at certain points. I think it was the livery in one of the hotels, which is really bizarre, but you had to check your guns in, and then you could whoop it up as much as you wanted to. What did you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think it's a product of necessity. I mean, and it dates back at least to those Dodge City, Abilene, those Kansas cow towns, because you had all of these cowpokes. I don't know what they called them before they called them all cowboys, because as you point out, Cowboys was the name of the gang at the time, and doesn't have the positive connotation that it has today for people. But you had these cow herders, these cow hands, those drives that you described, they weren't a week long. I mean, they were months long. And so here you have hundreds of them pouring into town with money jangling in their pockets, eager to, drink and be entertained, both with, music, gambling, and companionship. And, I don't know about you, but when you look at that recipe, the bread that bakes is one of disaster. I mean, people get drunk and start gambling. They fight. They get drunk and they start chasing women. They end up fighting over women. And any other, combinations you want to make out of that, those ingredients. And so if they're armed, they are going to solve those conflicts with firearms. And so, it wasn't something that Virgil Earp came up with strictly for Tombstone. I mean, as you point out, these sorts of solutions, they harken back to, even earlier times, post Civil War, but still. And so, you call it common sense gun control. I'm all for that, right? I mean, it makes sense. I mean, you're coming into town, you're going to drink, you're going to gamble, you're going to dance with the ladies. Then, check your gun, and when you leave, you can have it back because you're going to need it out there in the wild for a variety of reasons. There's Native Americans that are hostile. There's other cowboys that are hostile. There's creatures out there that are hostile. There's hunting to do. There's, it was a tool that was very necessary in that setting. I mean, definitely you needed your guns, but you really didn't need them while you were drinking and gambling and, visiting the women there. So I like it. I mean, you and I think might differ a little bit on modern day gun control concepts, although probably not as much as a lot of people do, because I don't think either of us is on the fringe. But this is what I would call, you call it common sense gun control. I would add it's situational gun control. I mean, even in an open carry state, you can't take your gun into a bar or a casino or, certain other an airport. Those are situational as well. And so it makes sense. It makes sense to me. And for the record, I have some, strong beliefs in favor of what the Second Amendment is there for. I'm not a gun grabber by any means, but I also think we could probably do some better things to make sure that situations and people where guns shouldn't be or who shouldn't have guns, maybe don't. Because, necessity, tends to push those sorts of things. And definitely that was going on in the setting of the Wild West that you're talking about. So Virgil put this into place, and the Cowboys were very flagrantly violating that law, and they were talking smack as well. That's what ended up, having, was the reason why Virgil and his deputies, his brothers, and Doc Holliday walked down the street to just outside the OK Corral, which, interestingly enough, that the corral itself was widened and made bigger to take in the area of the alley where the conflict actually happened. So now the current OK Corral, it actually happened at the OK Corral, not outside of it, like it did in real life.
Have you ever been?
I have not. When I was in Tucson for a mystery writers conference, one of the guys there who was also former law enforcement, they took a day trip up there on the anniversary of Morgan Earp's death, and he invited me to go, and I kind of regret not going. I had a panel the next day and other things I needed to do, so it really wasn't feasible. But I feel like I missed out. Have you been there?
No, I want to take a trip there. I always thought, how far could it be? But it's about a 12 or 13 hour drive.
Yeah, it's not far out of Tombstone. I think it's less, like maybe an hour, I think, is all.
One day, that's on the bucket list.
Well, let me know. I'll meet you there. We'll walk the walk.
Yeah. So the shootout at the OK Corral, really the reason is that there's a lot of hot and really bad blood between the Earps and the Cowboys, particularly the Clanton and McLowry brothers. But the real reason, or I guess the reason that Virgil puts forward, is that he's heard that they're armed in town, that they haven't checked in their guns at the places where they're supposed to. So Virgil's going to go and disarm them. And there's a lot of controversy, and you can go down any number of rabbit holes. Some people say they weren't armed. Some people say they were armed to the tooth. Some everything in between. Some of them were armed, some of them weren't. And some people say that Virgil and his party, which included his brother Wyatt Morgan, and then the infamous Doc Holliday, who was never really a lawman. He became a lawman by proxy through the Earps, but never a lawman in his own right. He comes and helps them on this raid, you might call it, to get the Cowboys' guns. It's an incredibly short affair, and we'll definitely discuss the movie's portrayal of it, but only 30 seconds. The Earps show up, they're shooting. Nobody's 100% sure. There's definitely a lot of evidence on both sides of who shot first, who drew their gun. In a couple of the books that I read, I think particularly the one that you suggested, Ride the Devil's Herd, they didn't call their gun holding device their holster. They called it their scabbard, which I thought, I kind of like that better. They drew from their scabbard, but who drew from their scabbard first is kind of a question. But in the end, Morgan Earp has been shot only superficially, and Virgil has been shot, and that's definitely not I mean, nobody really wants to get shot, but it's not a life-ending blow. But several of the Cowboys are killed, 3 of them, and 1 of them got away. Now, in the real life, did you have a really strong feeling? The one thing that I really got from it is that whether it was completely for his own benefit, or maybe he really was trying to let a little bit of steam and cool things down, the county sheriff, Johnny Behan, did seem to try and de-escalate the situation.
Yeah. Real quick to give a shout out to the book that you mentioned, Ride the Devil's Herd by John Bossenecker. I just recently read it, and I think your read of it was pretty recent as well. And what a well-written book. You talk about a very approachable read. I mean, some people don't like history books because they seem dry, and that's not at all the case with this Bossenecker book. He very engaging writer and an excellent history of this. And he kind of paints, I think, a pretty balanced picture of events, because I don't think it's one or the other. I mean, you look at the way the movie portrays Johnny Behan, and he's kind of a dandy, and he's pretty ineffectual and so forth. The history of how he presents himself obviously is very different. Usually the truth somewhere in the middle, and I mean, he most certainly had political alliances. I mean, if you look at the different times that there were criminal events that occurred in which he had to respond, sometimes he went out and arrested someone, but often, depending on who it was, he went out and, gosh darn it, just could not pick up a trail, and nothing ever came of it. And so, I mean, today we would call that corrupt, and they kind of did in that time period as well, but they were far more accepting of it. It was almost like it wasn't corruption, it was political allegiance, and so they shake their head and move on. Whereas today, if that were to happen, we'd be like, whoa, that's corrupt, and you're fired, and now somebody else is going to go track this down. So, did he make a good faith effort? I mean, I think he made a good faith effort to keep the Earps from going down there. I have my doubts as to whether he really truly disarmed these guys, because why would the county sheriff, who's in alignment with them, go and take their weapons from them? I mean, if he was a stand-up guy, straight and narrow sort of guy, and these were just people that he had respect for, I could see him saying, hey, give me your guns so you don't have any trouble. I'll hold on to them. I just don't think he was that stand up. I think he was a political animal. So are the Earps, and so he probably went down there and told them, the Earps are coming. You probably want to get rid of those guns or get ready to fight or figure out what you're going to do. And I'll try to stall them, and that is what I think happened. That rings the most true in respect to like human nature. What do you think?
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. I think you could definitely, that is highly probable. I think you could also maybe put in a sprinkling that maybe Behan did know they were armed to the teeth, drunk, fixing for a fight, and that if the Earps showed up, there was going to be gunplay, that a lot of people could have gotten killed. And I don't think that Behan wanted the Earps to be killed. I think that he could have been maybe not necessarily looking out for their best interest, but I don't think that he actively wanted them to be murdered. And I don't think that he wanted the Cowboys to be murdered. I think he saw that there was a powder keg there, and I think that when we get into the movie, there was a slippery element to Johnny Behan, but I don't take it that he was and he was certainly corrupt in the terms of in the definition of the age, and corrupt by our own definition. But I don't think that he was somebody who wanted to see a lot of violence going on. And yeah, technically they would have been breaking the law with the being armed in the town. But if you could diffuse it and maybe just keep them separated until the Earps cooled down a little bit and the Cowboys got sober and maybe even just left town, you could have avoided the bloodshed that happened. I don't think that's impossible either.
No, I mean, Behan was an elected official. And while he had his voting block, no doubt, he had his base. And his base seems to be amongst the Cowboys and their like-minded, townsfolk and ranchers in the county that were like-minded. At the same time, he's not going to want to promote events that disrupt the public peace or cause problems for people that might be on the fence about whether to vote for him or not. I mean, it seems, according to what I've read, and Boston Ecker gets into this, that people tended to vote along party lines. But you can't tell me that in any election there aren't fence sitters, and those sometimes can be what swing the vote. If you're a public official and you can get some good grace amongst the more neutral citizenry by how you comport yourself or the actions that you take, why wouldn't you? And I think that's probably where Behan was coming from. So I think you're bang on.
So then we move on as the smoke cleared after the shootout at the OK Corral. The McLowry brothers, two of the brothers are dead, and so is Ike Clanton's brother Billy. They're all dead. Afterwards, not too long afterwards, Morgan Earp, at one night, Morgan Earp is shot, and then Virgil Earp are shot. They're both, Morgan is grievously wounded and he'll die. Virgil's grievously wounded, but it's an extremity. And in those days, with the type of bullets they were shooting, it's very similar to the Civil War. You get hit, say, in the arm or in some extremity, you're very likely to lose that extremity. You get hit somewhere in the core, you're pretty much going to die, more or less. Your chances of survival are pretty slim.
Yeah, no life flight.
No, Morgan was shot in the spine and he lingers on for a couple of hours and he died. And it's interesting, he died right before he died at 11 p.m. and Wyatt's birthday was the next day, starting at 12. So I think that must have really hit Wyatt hard, especially because Morgan and Wyatt, I want to say they were only maybe 2 years apart. They were practically twins. They were so close together.
Irish twins.
Yeah, Irish twins. That's devastating to Wyatt. Virgil has pretty much checked out. He's done with it. Family, I believe it was their brother and father, moved to California, Southern California, and Virgil's out. He's had enough of this nonsense and he leaves, but Wyatt stays and sticks around for the Vendetta Ride, which is probably after the shootout at the OK Corral. The Vendetta Ride is likely the second most famous event. The assumption is that the Cowboys do this assassination. As far as evidence, if you were to produce something in court, it's very thin. You could probably pin it on the Cowboys pretty easily, but to pin it to any one individual would be very difficult. Curly Bill Brocious, who's somebody we haven't spoken about up to this point, but we will when we get more into the movie. He's suspected to be at least one of the people who pull the trigger. But again, there's no forensics evidence or video surveillance. There's nothing to that. It's just hearsay at that point.
Yeah. And I think this was a time period where eyewitnesses had a lot more weight than they do currently. I mean, eyewitnesses are still important. People want to hear what somebody else saw. Juries in particular, but today we have a much greater ability to process and understand and present forensic evidence, physical evidence, and that's not to say physical evidence didn't matter back then. It just wasn't as scientific and it wasn't as prevalent, I guess, when weighed against eyewitness testimony. Eyewitness testimony carried much more weight than it does probably today, and so also did supposition when it comes to not whether somebody could be arrested or convicted or not, but certainly in how people chose to respond to a crime or something along these lines. And so Wyatt had no doubt that the Cowboys were behind this, and he had some ideas as to which ones. And so he gathered up his posse, essentially. He got himself a federal commission to protect him from what are essentially extra legal assassinations that he was carrying out. And he was successful to a degree. I mean, there were outstanding warrants issued for his arrest after this. In fact, I don't think he ever went back to Arizona after it became a state or even to the territory because those warrants still existed. Nobody was going to seek him out and arrest him and try to extradite him. But if he found himself, in Tucson or something, then that might be a different story. Which is interesting because he was commissioned as a federal peace officer at the time that they went on this Vendetta Ride, but the state. Or the territory that they were in, there were other law enforcement entities that were some of the Cowboys were given commissions as well. So, once again, you have public offices being used for personal gain, personal protection, to provide a veneer, a veil of legality to what was essentially they call it a Vendetta Ride for a reason. I mean, there was a revenge set of assassinations for revenge purposes.
The Vendetta Ride is just completely enveloped in legend and myth. Many people were killed on that. Well, the legend is that many were killed, and we'll look at some of the sources that say that he killed, I think, up to four or five people, which doesn't sound like a lot if you're saying the Vendetta Ride, but that killing 4 or 5 people is quite a bit. Mm-hmm. He may have killed Curly Bill Brocious. He may not have. There wasn't a lot of independent verification, and somebody like Curly Bill had a lot of enemies, so anybody could have killed him. He may have killed another famous cowboy named Johnny Ringo, but again, there's a lot of controversy of who killed Johnny Ringo. But ultimately, these people do get killed in this rough time period.
I think there's far more evidence that he killed Curly Bill Brocious than Johnny Ringo. I mean, Johnny Ringo almost certainly was a suicide. based on the objective evidence that is generally accepted historically. There's multiple accounts of the Curly Brocious attack, the fight that they had, but I mean, there's enough of them that put Earp as the trigger man there that I think that's pretty solid. But it's not like he went on a well, I guess technically it's a spree killing, but there are plenty. It would rank pretty low in the history of spree killings if you were to use body count as a measurement tool. I think the OK Corral legend fuels it a little bit, and the idea that he's avenging his brothers. I think that adds a certain romanticism to it. And when did it become famous? I mean, it was obviously well known contemporary to when it occurred, but much like a lot of the Wyatt Earp legend, it really became, enshrined in myth almost, in the 1920s, and when Hollywood got involved, and when Stuart Lake's book was written, and these different accounts made the events popular again. And by the time that happened, they were 40, 50 years in the past, some of these events. I mean, for an ancient writer, we consider that to be pretty close in time and space. But in today's, world, I mean, can you imagine it's like me writing a book today about somebody, from 1970, about events that happened in 1970 when I was 2 years old. So I clearly don't know anything except what I've read and heard. And, how many events from the 1970s have been enshrined in some kind of mythology even today? And I think it's magnified in that time period simply because the means of communication and the means of record keeping and on all of this was much less communal. There wasn't an internet or, as many newspapers and as many depositories of information as there are today and were even 50 years ago. So it's an interesting thing to ponder, the way these myths get made. Certainly the events are worthy of myth making. But, this Vendetta Ride, 4 or so people killed. I agree with you. That's an impressive number. I mean, 1 wounded brother and 1 dead brother equals, 4 killings. That math doesn't wash, does it? So, but I think they make more of it in the movie than maybe it was in reality. But it's still a pretty impressive response. I mean, all accounts are that he was very single-minded and quite furious in this endeavor.
That's essentially where the movie ends, is at the end of the Vendetta Ride. The rest of the story for Wyatt, really in the short, is that he essentially just follows the West until it ends. He goes from the next boom to the next boom to the next boom. He went to Los Angeles for a time, or as in the beginning of the movie, they call it Los Angeles. Then they go to, he goes to Alaska, goes back to Los Angeles. He does a lot of things that, again, are sort of on the knife's edge, sitting on the fence between legality and illegality. He becomes tied in with some famous, very early Western movie actors. Tom Mix, I believe, was one of them.
William Hart, I think, is another one.
Yeah, they would not necessarily be household names today, but probably for our grandparents, they might be, or even great grandparents. They would have been the Bruce Willis's or Sylvester Stallone's of their day. I might be aging myself with those references, but you get the drift. And that's really the end. That's the end of his story, is he starts off as one of the blazing pioneers of this Wild West, and then he ends his life as one of the blazing pioneers of the legend and the myth creation of the Wild West through the film industry. So I think that's a really cool way to bookend your life.
Yeah, his post Tombstone time is interesting. I was surprised, and I did not know that he spent time, or maybe it was one of the other brothers, but they spent time up in my neck of the woods, up in Spokane for a while. I think that Wyatt and Sadie spent time in Portland, Oregon, for a bit. But yeah, you characterize him as following the boom, and he certainly did. I mean, Alaska being a really good example and so forth. He also got mixed up in some refereeing, but refereeing some very big boxing matches, one of which was an illegal match that had like 10,000 people attend or something like that, including a bunch of law enforcement officers who were there. I think that was in San Francisco, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, he lived a life for sure. And I heard or read that John Wayne claims to have met him in his youth and to have modeled his iconic walk after the way that Earp walked. Now that could be, that could be one legend co-opting another, at some point, who knows? But the through string there is kind of nice to think of, that it could be true.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. We've laid out the history of the story, and I think that that's important because I think it'll help you understand it. I mean, I can't imagine anybody's watching this or listening to this podcast who's never watched the movie. I highly suggest you go watch the movie again and again. I can't even tell you how many times that I've watched Tombstone. But Frank, let's get into the characters, because this is a really character-driven movie.
Yeah, I mean, it was, there's really no need to summarize the film because it follows the history that we just talked about. I mean, the Earp's arrival in Tombstone and through the Vendetta Ride with a little bit of an epilogue. It is just so chock full of good actors who really seem to have inhabited the roles that they were playing to a huge degree. I mean, I believe Kurt Russell as Wyatt Earp. I mean, I think he really pulls it off well. He's got that steely gaze. He's got that calm resolve. He's got that bit of brashness to him. He does a great job. Of course, everybody talks about how Val Kilmer depicted Doc Holliday in this movie. I mean, I think did he win an Oscar for it, or did he get a nomination at least for supporting actor?
Not sure.
That'd be worth Googling, probably. I mean, it's one of those things where if he didn't, he was robbed, because he's just absolutely brilliant in that role, and he made some creative decisions to play him as almost a Southern aristocrat and how he presented himself. And he's comedy gold, but Kilmer worked really hard on his draw to be believable as not just a smooth draw, but a quick draw on his weapon as he took his gun from his scabbard. And so, and then, Sam Elliott played Virgil, and I think he's the perfect Virgil. I mean, he has the mustache for it, clearly, but that older resolve that's very, and that idea of being a little more Law and Order than his other brothers, perhaps. And so when we see Virgil say they're wearing guns and they're talking about killing us, and Wyatt's trying to talk him out of it and tells him, that's a misdemeanor. You'll never make that stick, and all that kind of stuff. Wyatt's looking at the practical angle of it, and Virgil's looking at the legalistic version of it, Law and Order. And I don't know that he was that much different than his brother, but his choices seem to, point that direction. And I think Sam Elliott just played that role so well. And then, of course, you've got Bill Paxton as Morgan Earp. I think he had a little more exuberance in the way he played that role. He played it a little younger than the other two did, and I think that came through. Michael Biehn, who is one of my favorite action action actors. He played Johnny Ringo, and Johnny Ringo was portrayed in this film as just, having a black hole in the middle of the soul or something, I mean, and boy, Bean sure brought that out. In fact, one of my favorite lines, underrated lines of the film is when, they were watching the production of Faust and making, deal with the devil and all that. And Curly Brocious talks about what he'd do if he made a deal with the devil. And then he asked Johnny Ringo, what would you do? And Michael Biehn just looks at him and says, I already done it. It's such a good line. And he carries it off, I mean, he's really good. And the list goes on and on. I mean, Billy Bob Thornton is in this, Michael Rooker, Thomas Hayden Church, Stephen Lang plays Ike Clanton, and what a great job he did portraying Clanton. Not a very favorable depiction. He kind of plays him as a little bit of a coward. And I don't think that is probably very historically accurate. He didn't come off that way in the books that I read anyway. Did he to you, by the way? Did you think that was a mischaracterization?
Not entirely. I think that there seemed like there was a little sliminess behind Ike, that he wasn't as stand-up and as quick to go to the revolvers as some of the others, but he wasn't a straight-up coward, I don't think, that they portrayed him in the film.
I don't think you could be in that time. I just don't think you'd survive if you were flat out coward. And calling somebody that was, probably the biggest insult you could hurl. The one that Jason Priestley was in there too, which is kind of funny because I think this was still pretty much around the 90210 Beverly Hills show was still going on. So that was an interesting piece. And Dana Delaney played Sadie, and I thought she did a tremendous job. I can't remember the woman's name who played Maddie, Wyatt's common law wife before he met Sadie. A lot of a lot of the different history books theorize that she may have been a prostitute at one time. But definitely an opium addict, a laudanum addict. And that, I thought she portrayed that role really, really well, that actress. And Powers Booth was Curly Bill Brocious, and he had a great role, and he played it well. That was the one that just, I felt like I could see Powers Booth acting, and he's the only one that I felt that about. And that's probably my own shortcoming. I don't think that's very commonly shared. And so it's probably just me, but, certainly he had some great scenes and was a pivotal character.
Yeah, I think, and that really leads into some of the things that I love. It's just that the incredible cool factor. Everybody was cool. Everybody acted extremely well. I think with Powers Booth, and maybe you could push back on this, I think that the Curly Bill that sort of comes through, especially if you read the Ride the Devil Herd book, and some of the other sources, is he was a real mixture of happy-go-lucky and just super dark. And I think that Booth was trying to get that through, and it came off as a little cartoonish at times.
That's a good way to put it. It wasn't that I didn't. Yeah, that cartoonish is a good way to put it. It wasn't that I could tell he was acting. Maybe it was a cartoonish portrayal. That's a good way to put it, Steve. And I think that's how I'm going to say it from now on, because that more accurately touches on the difficulty I had with his character. But the real Curly Bill was a chameleon, or he was bipolar, one or the two. I mean, but he seemed to be able to mix with a lot of different types of people in the frontier life that he was part of. And there were some examples of him kind of being a bit of a peacemaker, actually. So he was a complicated character for sure.
Maybe we can talk about one of our favorite scenes. For me, my favorite scene, I think, just because it tied so well into the history, is there was a famous incident between the Cowboys and the first town marshal, Fred White. And Fred White in the movies, I think it's almost universal. He's portrayed as a really old man, but historically, he was only 30 or 31 when this whole event happened. But he confronted Curly Bill Brocious, who was drunk and potentially high. He goes to disarm Brocious, and somehow the gun goes off. And I love that scene, the way it was portrayed in the film and in reality, because it was just complete fog of war. And I'm sure you saw these incidents in your career where something happened and nobody really precisely knows what happened, but that there was a really bad consequence at the end. And Curly Bill's gun went off and Sheriff Fred White died. Maybe in reality, the movie shows it that Curly Bill, which Curly Bill apparently was famous for, is that he would hand somebody the butt of the gun, but he would flip it around real fast and he could shoot with it. And some said that that's what happened, and that's what's portrayed in the movie. Some other people think that the gun that they commonly used was notorious for accidentally discharging. And Fred White, by some people's view, was that he grabbed the barrel of the gun, basically the business end of it, and it wouldn't take too much for those guns to accidentally misfire. And it may have accidentally misfired and killed Fred White. And that's actually what Fred White said on his deathbed, is that he said that Curly Bill didn't shoot him. There was also that it's possible that it was Wyatt Earp's own fault, that he went to grab Curly Bill from behind before he hit him with his own gun. And that by grabbing Curly Bill from behind accidentally discharged his gun. But I think it's so cool that something like that could just become, so many people saw it, but they saw it from all different viewpoints.
Yeah, and how do you portray that in the film? I mean, you kind of have to pick a lane and show it. Yeah. And they kind of went with the what did they call that? Was it the curly roll or that move had a name, and then I think it was associated with Curly Bill directly. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great scene. One of my favorite scenes is the immediate aftermath of that, where he's going to arrest. Earp's going to make an arrest there, citizen's arrest, and the Cowboys, circle in and say, let him go. And he's like, I'm not doing it, so you can just go home. And they push it. And that is an event that mirrors a one from Earp's life, where he had a guy in custody, and a group of people showed up to hang him, a vigilante group. They're going to take the guy out and just give him summary execution, and he wouldn't let him. And there's 20 of them or whatever, 12 of them, however many, and just him. I mean, he's got a 6-shooter, so again, that math doesn't wash. But he faced him down, and he basically kind of dirty harried him a little bit, and said, yeah, you can get to him, but it's going to cost you 6 of you, which 6 of you want it. And that's what happens in this Tombstone scene, where, he puts the gun right up to Ike Clanton's head and says, your friends might get me in a rush, but not before I turn your head into a canoe, which is a great line. And then somebody else is like, he's bluffing. And you see Ike just, no, he's not. He's not bluffing. It's further painting him, to maybe be cowardly. But I mean, I don't think I'd feel too brave with a 6-gun, pressed up against my forehead. But that was a cool scene. It showed the kind of resolve I think you would need to be to just live in that era, much less to. The thing about this movie, Steve, and we talked about this off mic and via email for weeks leading up to this, the movie isn't always historically accurate. In fact, it's very inaccurate sometimes, but it's also very accurate sometimes. And even where it is not strictly accurate, sometimes it captures the spirit of the event, even if it's not, technically correct. And I haven't seen a lot of movies make such an incredible attempt at accuracy. from the way that people dress to the use of language, to the props, to small little moments that they put in there that are historically relevant and accurate to give you a feel for, or, an accurate feel for the way it must have been. I think you have to really salute their effort at doing that, even if they're, the whole shootout between Doc Holliday and Johnny Ringo almost certainly didn't happen. I mean, he almost certainly fell asleep in the desert with the horse got loose and ran off without his boots. And he walked around for a while and decided he wasn't going to get out alive and didn't want to die of thirst. So he shot himself. But there are people out here who say, no, he was murdered and it was made to look like a suicide. Okay. He certainly didn't get in a shootout with Doc Holliday, who I think was, dying in a sanitarium in Boulder, Colorado, or Denver or wherever, at that time. So, not very accurate, but he caught the spirit of both characters in that scene. So even when they're not accurate, they're accurate to the spirit of it, if not the letter of it. And, the language, I love the language, the way they use terminology, with that scene where Wyatt is facing down Billy Bob Thornton's Johnny Tyler character and the terminology that they use, about, getting the bulge on a tub like you and, jerk those pistols and get to work, skin that smoke wagon and see what happens.
Yes.
It's like that. It's just the jargon and the and the clothing and all that stuff. I think it was pretty cool.
Was there anything you didn't love about it? You got into a little bit about Powers Booth's portrayal of Curly Bill. Was there anything else that maybe you didn't love as much?
Some of the things that you talked about, it's a movie, and so they have to have a hero, and Wyatt Earp is the hero. But, historically, it's far more nuanced. And so, that I wouldn't say I don't like that, but if I was going to criticize it, that would be the critique. I'd steal that from your list and use it because, I as a writer, I really like to explore nuance, and I like to write, books that contain characters that are nuanced to where this person, Steve may be the protagonist. He's not necessarily the hero. And yet he may have heroic qualities, even though he's also fallible. That's interesting to me. They get a little bit of that with Earp. He's not, perfect or anything, but he's pretty heroically portrayed, and the Cowboys are vilified. And the truth is really very different than that. But they found ways, going back to what I like, they found ways to slip some of that in there. If you look at the history of it, Wyatt Earp and his brothers were pimps at times. You don't see anything of that in this film, except when Ike Clanton gets mad in the Oriental there and starts talking smack, and he calls them pimps, and it comes out of the blue in the movie. You're like, well, is that just an insult? I guess you call somebody a pimp, you son of a gun, whatever. No, it was their history, and it was following them into Tombstone, and so they were, he was making that accusation. So it was almost a nod to the historical truth of the Earp brothers. And so, even though they painted a very different picture than what history is at times about them, at the same time, they found a way to rectify that just a little bit by adding things in like that.
Really, for me, there was a couple of just really two things that really irked me with the historical accuracy that I had a hard time looking past. One was the portrayal of Billy Breckenridge, the Jason Priestley character. And they made him look effete and a city slicker, and that he was basically a tool all the way up into the end. And it was really Billy Breckenridge was far more of an upstanding citizen than Wyatt Earp ever could be. He worked in politics. He worked in several government agencies from Washington all the way out west. He also wrote what was up in certain categories, really the firsthand perspective of the events. It was called Eldorado, was the name of the book, and it was seen as probably the most unbiased version. Some people, the Earps, obviously said it was biased, but he did seem to try to write an unbiased version of the story. So I thought, I didn't love that aspect of it. I guess it was kind of a throwaway character, but I think they could have just avoided that altogether, but besides like slandering somebody.
Well, and they really made a lot of allusions to that character being gay, and I'm fine with that. I mean, it's not like, gay people suddenly became in existence in 1971 or something. I mean, it's a human reality, and it's been part of our makeup as a people for, as long as from time immemorial. But if you're going to bring it up about somebody, what's the point, right? I mean, and there really wasn't one. It wasn't a diversity move or something like that. They weren't trying, to say, see, the gay guy can be a tough guy too. In fact, almost the opposite. They call him Sissy Boy at one point, and even though he's portrayed in the film as a stand-up, decent person, he's not a very impactful character. And so, yeah, I agree with you. I didn't really get the point of that character other than the person historically did exist, but he's the one that kind of got short shrift a bit. You're onto something there, Steve.
And then the last thing that I'll quibble with a little bit is Robert Mitchum, right in his beginning narration, which I thought it was really cool how they did throw a lot of the old timer 50s and 60s cowboy actors like Robert Mitchum, and then Charlton Heston had a brief cameo, is that they called the Cowboys the early example of organized crime, which, I mean, that's just silly. I mean, on the face of it, they weren't really organized crime as such as what we might classify as organized crime by the strictest definition. And I mean, there had been gangs since the 1820s, the 1810s that were by every definition organized crime. So I think that they were trying to portray the Cowboys as something that they really weren't, with the red sashes, and that they were the sort of the proto Crips and Bloods. I don't think that really was, certainly wasn't an accurate portrayal. And I don't know how much it carried forward to the movie that this was an organized element against the good versus evil thing that they were really going for in the movie.
Yeah, they were definitely a gang. There's no question, but you called them a loose affiliation. I think they're something slightly more than that, but maybe less than the way we would define a gang today. They're not a corporate gang or anything like that. But, come on, organized crime has been going on since how long, I mean,
yeah,
since Mesopotamia, probably, I'm guessing. So, but, it doesn't take away from this movie being an absolutely, stellar, visual spectacle. The acting is outstanding. There are so many good lines. I mean, we haven't even said "I'm your Huckleberry" yet. We've been talking for over an hour. I mean, that's just, everybody knows that line, and "You're a daisy if you do." And, there's just so many great lines in this film. One of the ones that jumps out at me as being completely underrated is after the near face-off in the street between Johnny Ringo and Doc Holliday, where he used the "I'm your Huckleberry" line, when that, goes nowhere because some of the Cowboys realize that Ringo might be too drunk to win. That whole thing, Val Kilmer's character, Doc Holliday, was getting a shave. He was interrupted his shave. So he goes back and sits down, and he just says in this very aristocratic way, "Barber, you may proceed, sir," or something like that. And he's just like totally unruffled by the fact that he just about got into a shootout that was a life and death, situation. And he's just going to finish his shave and have his mustache waxed or whatever. It's great characterization. And the movie is just so full of, I mean, do you have a favorite line?
Mine by far is Curly Bill, when the Virgil was wounded and Morgan's dead and Virgil is leaving, and Wyatt Earp escorting Virgil to the train station in Tucson. And Wyatt says, well, this is over, Curly. And Curly Bill's just sitting there, and he just smiles and says, well, bye.
Yeah,
and
then
he like looks over and just smirks. And that one always had like a personal connection to me, because right around when this movie came out, maybe just a few years afterwards, our family, we watched it all the time. And my brother, he was leaving for college. My mother was just a wreck because her boy was leaving, and we probably weren't going to see him until, the whole thing before Christmas. And I wouldn't get out of bed to go see him off. And she was like, get out of bed and go say goodbye to your brother. And I just looked at him and said, well, bye. And then we all cracked up and everything. And I think it shows how movies and, these connections can really, they bring us together.
Yeah. A deep cut line that doesn't get quoted very often is when Doc Holliday's winning a whole bunch of poker hands at Ike Clanton's expense, and he quips that maybe poker's just not your game, Ike. I know. How about a spelling contest? It's just, he was so insufferable. He's one of those characters that if that you love on the screen, that if you lived around them, you'd probably join the Cowboys just to get a chance to take a shot at it. But how good was Kilmer in that role? My God, I wasn't joking at the beginning of this episode when I said it's probably the second most quotable movie ever. There's just so many lines. We could spend half an hour shooting lines back and forth, and laughing about them because they were so good and delivered so well by these actors. There's always a danger of movies that you watched at a formative time in your life that had an impact on you. 1993, I was just starting in law enforcement. It was my first year. I was 25 years old, beginning this new career. And here's this movie that's so outstanding. And so it, kind of imprinted on me a little bit, much the way Top Gun did when I was a senior in high school, and all of that. Sometimes those movies don't hold up when you go back and look at them, in your 40s and 50s, and you're removed from them by decades, both in your life, and obviously the medium has changed and everything. This movie holds up every time I see it. It's so well done that it never loses its luster. And that's not true of a lot of movies. I've gone back and watched a few, and you and I have talked about a couple of them that just don't hold up in the same way. This one certainly does.
Yeah, that's really my final assessment as well, is that I watched it in 1993, probably every few years after that. And then just for the recording of this episode, watched it within the last few days, and I enjoyed it as much as I did every single time, which I think that is the gold standard for a movie. It didn't feel aged at all. It felt that it's the themes that it hit on back then were the themes that were just as enjoyable today. The scenes, the lines, it just really had everything in it.
Yeah, this movie is my Huckleberry.
Well, bye.